When the Americans landed in Vietnam on the 8th of March 1965, they faced some of the most horrifying weapons ever, from the literal venomous snake traps to the hidden RPG-7 ambushes. But among all of that horror, they did not expect to fight one of the most underestimated full autocannons of the entire conflict, the KPV 14.5mm heavy machine gun. It fires a round with nearly twice the muzzle energy of a 50 cal, like the M2 Browning, and can be seen in everything from Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare to War Thunder. But how was this powerful cannon birthed from the simple rugged World War II anti-tank rifle, and what horrors did it unleash upon American troops in Korea? Well, that's what you're going to hear today. But before we get into it, the next couple minutes will be difficult to stomach, so now you're warned. You see, by the middle of the Second World War, the Soviets had a serious headache on their hands. Their anti-tank rifles, the PTRD and the PTRS, fired a monstrous 14.5mm round that could punch clean through the early German panzers. But as the fighting dragged on, German tanks grew thicker armor, and a man lying in the foliage with a rifle could barely scratch them anymore. So those rifles slid into uselessness, yet that brutal cartridge was simply too good to throw away. And this is where a designer named Semyon Vladimirov walks into the story. In 1944, he took that anti-tank round and built a full auto machine gun around it, and this gun would become something truly special. The result was the Krupnokaliberny Pulyemyat Vladimirova, or KPV for short. And nothing the West fielded came close to it. Think of it as bolting the power of an anti-tank rifle onto the steady rhythm of a machine gun. It runs on a short recoil system with a rotating bolt that locks straight into the barrel, which is about the only sane way to tame around this savage. The whole barrel could be ripped off and swapped in seconds once it glowed cherry red, and the belt could be fed in from either side. The recoil from that 14.5 cartridge is so violent that the gun alone weighs about 49 kilograms, far too much for a man to fire off the shoulder. Every shot leaves the muzzle at roughly 1,000 meters a second, hauling around 31,000 joules of raw energy behind it. The famous American 50 cal Browning, the workhorse of their army, manages barely half of that. Its rounds came in nasty flavors too, from armor-piercing slugs with a tungsten carbide core to a high-explosive incendiary that lit up whatever it touched. Just one of those rounds could punch clean through a man and the brick wall behind him without slowing down. Spitting out nearly 600 rounds a minute, the KPV could core straight through 32mm of steel armor at 500 meters. So one short burst would chew apart a truck, a brick wall, or whatever poor soul was crouching behind either. But the Soviets were nowhere near the only ones who saw what a round like this could do. Back in 1939, the Americans drew up their own monstrous 60 caliber round, built to crack 32mm of armor at 500 yards, the very same mark the Soviets were chasing. But their anti-tank rifle for it went nowhere, and the heavy machine guns they built around that round never beat the trusty 50 cal. So they gave up and necked that cartridge out into the 20mm shell you now know from the Vulcan. By 1949, it was in Soviet service, and they had slowly handed their future enemies a weapon that would haunt American pilots for decades. But the KPV's very first taste of real war would actually leave the Soviets a little disappointed. It was first dreamed up as an infantry weapon, hauled around on a heavy-wheeled mount that a small crew could tow into position. But there was an obvious obstacle with that plan. At well over 100 pounds with its carriage, the thing was a brute to lug across rough ground, and your average rifleman wanted nothing to do with it. So Soviet engineers had a smarter idea, and they bolted the KPV onto anti-aircraft mounts instead. One barrel became the ZPU-1, 2 barrels the ZPU-2, and 4 barrels the fearsome ZPU-4, all wheeled and ready in well under a minute. And it was in Korea, from 1950 onward, that this family got its first real taste of combat in the hands of Chinese and North Korean crews. They pointed those barrels skyward and hammered away at the low-flying UN aircraft prowling over the peninsula. Well, the results turned out, honestly, underwhelming. You see, the jets of the early 1950s flew high and fast, and the little 14.5 only really hit hard at low altitude, nearly 1,400 meters up. Down low, though, it was murder, and any pilot who dropped in to strafe or bomb a target flew straight into a shredder. The heavy lifting against UN bombers was left to bigger guns, like the 37mm flak, and the KPV ended up sitting in their shadow. Still, set up on its four-wheel carriage, A ZPU-4 crew could be in action in 15 seconds, then break down and slip away before the counterfire arrived. For a weapon this powerful, that had to sting. Yet a decade later, in the jungles of a very different kind of war, the exact same gun would become the nightmare of American pilots. When American helicopters started swarming over Vietnam, the North Vietnamese pulled out the ZPU and turned it into a nightmare. You see, the real genius was never the gun on its own, it was how they hid the thing. These mounts were light enough that crews could strip them into pieces and haul them deep into the jungle on bicycles and pack animals. So they tucked the guns under thick foliage, completely invisible from the air, and they simply waited. And they did not just plant one gun and hope for the best. They would set up 2 or 3 ZPU-4s together, each angled at a different height, layering their fire so a chopper had nowhere clean to fly. And when all 4 barrels of a ZPU-4 opened up at once, they could throw out a combined storm of well over 1,000 rounds a minute. A helicopter would drop low to insert troops or pull out the wounded, and the tree line would suddenly erupt with a wall of 14.5mm tracer. And remember, this was a round built to kill tanks, now tearing into thin helicopter skin. A single burst could shred a rotor, flood a cockpit with fire, or fold an engine in on itself. And the tracer alone was terrifying, glowing chunks of fire far bigger than any rifle round, drifting up slowly before tearing past in the blink of an eye. The worst part of that experience was the silence before it started, because the hidden Vietnamese ZPU crew made almost no sound until that first burst tore the helicopters apart. By then, a helicopter was often already deep inside the kill zone, with no good way out. The medevac crews had it worst of all, since they had to hover dead still over the wounded, while every gun in the tree line zeroed in. Vietnamese gun crews became experts at this deadly hide-and-seek, shifting their positions night after night, so the Americans could never map them. But the true scale of what these hidden guns did is what really stunned the Americans. Across the war, these guns are credited with downing scores of helicopters, along with a long string of fixed-wing aircraft. By the late 1960s, American intelligence rated the quad-barreled ZPU-4 as the single most dangerous threat their helicopters faced. By the end of the war, the Americans had lost almost 5,000 helicopters, and most of the ones shot down fell to ground fire like this. So the Americans were forced to change how they flew altogether, hugging the treetops and racing in fast to cheat the gunners of a clean shot. But once that war ended, the KPV flatly refused to fade into a museum, and instead, it found a whole new and far dirtier life. After Vietnam, the guns spread across the planet, ending up in the arsenals of over 50 nations and countless rebel factions. And somewhere along the way, fighters worked out that you did not need a tank to carry one. You just needed a simple Toyota pickup truck. So they took the ZPU off its wheels, welded it to the flatbed of a Toyota, and created what the world now calls a technical. Fighters fell in love with it for one simple reason, since the same cheap and nearly unbreakable gun would punch through walls, trucks, and low aircraft alike. It was crude and rugged, yet absolutely devastating in the right hands. In the deserts of Chad and Libya, rebel armies swept across hundreds of miles in fleets of these gun trucks, looking like something out of a Mad Max movie. In fact, this whole idea has a birthplace, and it is a war so lopsided that historians simply call it the Great Toyota War, when the tiny nation of Chad faced a Libyan army under Muammar Gaddafi stacked with hundreds of Soviet tanks, jets, and attack helicopters in 1987. But the Chadians had something faster. Fleets of Toyota pickups, bristling with machine guns and rockets, darting across the open desert like a swarm of gnats. On the 2nd of January, a commander named Hassan Jamous threw 3,000 of these men at the Libyan stronghold Fada. Well, what followed was a slaughter that Libya never saw coming. In a single brutal morning, the Chadians wrecked an entire armored brigade, leaving 784 Libyans dead and 92 tanks burning in the sand. And the cost to Chad was almost nothing, just 18 men and 3 of those little trucks. The lesson stunned the whole world, since a fleet of farm trucks had just humiliated a modern tank army. When the Islamic State stormed the city of Mosul in 2014, technicals mounting heavy guns like the KPV were right at the tip of that lightning assault. The same gun trucks prowled the rubble of Mogadishu and the broken streets around Grozny and Chechnya, and Iraq fielded them against coalition jets in Desert Storm. But the KPV was not only riding on trucks, it had slowly become the muscle of entire armored fleets. In its KPV-T form, built for vehicles, it became the main gun on Soviet carriers like the BTR-60 and the BTR-80, plus the BRDM-2 scout car. That round would get a light armored carrier, and the Navy even bolted the gun onto patrol boats to chew up anything that floated too close. So whether it sat on a multi-million-dollar war machine or a rusted-out farm truck, that 14.5 round still landed like a hammer. And that brings us to right now, where this 80-year-old design is doing something nobody in 1944 could have ever pictured. In Ukraine, the skies are now thick with cheap Iranian-designed Shahed drones, buzzing in to slam into cities and power plants. And shooting one down with a modern missile is a losing trade, because that missile can cost far more than the drone it kills. So both sides went digging through their Cold War stockpiles, and they pulled out the old KPV. The Czech firm Excalibur Army even took the twin-barreled ZPU-2, dropped it onto a Toyota pickup, and built a nimble little drone hunter for the Ukrainian army. That little rig reaches out to roughly 2 kilometers, which is plenty for a slow target skimming overhead. Each truck carries day and night sights so the crew can hunt in the dark, firing straight from the cab without ever stepping out. You see, a Shahed flies low and slow, which is exactly the sort of target this gun was already shooting back in Vietnam. A single drone might cost the enemy $20,000 to $50,000 to build, while a burst of 14.5mm is almost an afterthought, so the math flips completely, and suddenly the cheapest gun on the battlefield is downing the very weapon meant to bleed your defenses dry. And the orders just keep growing, with well over 100 of these little gun trucks now promised to the Ukrainians. So a weapon born to gut German tanks that grew up shredding American helicopters is now shooting drones out of a 21st century sky. Both Russia and Ukraine now run these guns from trucks and rooftops, hunting the drones that slip in under the expensive radar nets. It is a strange kind of immorality for a gun built around a round that was first meant to stop Hitler's panzers. It is the same short recoil action, the same monstrous round, and the same brutal logic Vladimirov sketched out while the Second World War was still burning.